Today we intend to look at Hadhrami migration, and in order to do that, we have to first understand that the Yemen is one of the largest Arab countries in terms of population. And the Yemen was divided into two halves, northern Yemen and southern Yemen. And the southern Yemen is what is better known as the Hadramaut. The two parts of Yemen, although they are united by language, religion, but the attitudes are relatively different. One of the most traumatic experiences that was experienced by Yemen was the introduction of communism into Yemen. Some of the Yemenis were converted to Marxism, and because of that, they looked down upon and persecuted those from the south, and especially the Sayyid clans, the Ashraf of South Yemen, or the Hadramaut. But later they were overwhelmed, and the Yemen went back to its separate constituents. And the Hadramis are the most widespread group of Yemenis, and their migration has seen them move to East Africa and to Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Indonesia, and of course Singapore. You find significant numbers of Hadramis in those parts of South Asia. The Hadramis are called Hadramis, or where they come from is called the Hadramaut, because death was a constant threat. They were faced with constant droughts, famines, and other calamities. So this forced them to go outside the Hadramaut. And those that migrated again, of course, basically for economic reasons. But then there were also religious reasons why some of these clans migrated. And the most famous of these clans are the Ashraf, those who claimed descent from the Prophet Mohamed. So they went out with the express purpose of spreading Islam. And there are interesting accounts of this. Although communism had been overcome, but there was still opposition, towards these, the Ashraf, the descendants of the Prophet, by a group called Irfan or Al-Islah group. Those who believed that they wanted reform. And the accounts of the activities of these people has been captured very well by Professor Abdullah Bujra in his widely read book called The Politics of Stratification, which talks about these issues of conflict between the Sayyids and some groups that were anti-Sayyids. But on the whole, those, for example, who migrated to East Africa and those who migrated to Southeast Asia, which, as we said earlier, included Malaysia and Indonesia, were of identical backgrounds. They spoke the same language. They ate the same kind of food. They dressed the same way. And of course, all of them were Shafi. So it was not easy to distinguish those Hadramis who came to East Africa and those who were in Indonesia and in Malaysia, including the names. For example, in East Africa here, we find names like Karama, Islam, Awad. Those are the same names that you will find in Indonesia and Malaysia. And the Ashraf clans, again, you find, for example, the Attasis in East Africa. You find the Attasis in Indonesia and Malaysia. You find Jamali Lail in East Africa, and you find them in Indonesia and Malaysia. Ahdali, again, Al-Ahdali, you find them in East Africa and also in Singapore and in Malaysia. So these two areas are actually tied together. The only difference are the local languages. For example, here, the Hadramis also have adopted Kiswahili. And in Indonesia and Malaysia, of course, they've adopted the Malay language. By the way, there is very little difference between Malay language and the language that is spoken by the Filipinos. Yeah, they are the same. The Filipinos were converted to Christianity, and of course the Malays were converted to Islam. But they've not always been Muslim. The Malay were Buddhists, and in fact you can even see that in the architecture of the mosques. If you go to places like Thailand, you go to Indonesia and in Malaysia. So there are a lot of very interesting parallels between these groups. In East Africa, the Hadramis were amongst the very first, to bring literacy to these parts of the world. The only difference is that they adopted Kiswahili as their mother tongue and wrote their poetry, wrote some of their treatises, both in Arabic and Kiswahili. And the same thing happened with Malaysia and Indonesia. So they've been quite influential intellectually. A number of them have also got into politics and have become very prominent people in the societies in which they have been living. Like, for example, in Indonesia, the foreign minister of Indonesia was Al-Attas. Some of the leading intellectuals were Al-Attas, like Hussein Al-Attas, who wrote the famous book, The Myth of the Lazy Native, who was a professor of sociology and spoke Dutch, Malay, English, and Arabic. In fact, his son is now occupying his father's position at the University of Singapore. And they still have ties to Indonesia and Malaysia. Some of these people have also very interesting history. Like the Attasis' maternal side were the ladies, Circassian ladies, who were in Central, in the Caucasus. And they were brought in as gifts to the sultans there. So they were married by the by the sultans and had children by these. So these particular Al-Atasis have ties to the Caucasus, and they also have ties to Hadhramaut, and they have ties to Malaysia and Indonesia. I guess we can also say more or less the same kinds of things with the Hadramis of Sharifite background. There's a very interesting article by a professor of Islamic Studies, University of London, the School of Oriental and African Studies, who gave an inaugural lecture entitled The Sayyids of Hadhramaut, in which he talks about the history of these Sharif families, both in East Africa and in Southeast Asia. But one of the most famous, or if we can say, the most famous Hadhrami scholar was, of course, Ibn Khaldun. Although he was born in Spain, grew up in and worked in Tunisia, Egypt, and other places. But he was of Hadhrami descent. In fact, they still use the term Ibn Khaldun al-Hadhrami. So that's the basic outline of the Hadhrami stories in areas where we find concentrations of this particular ethnic group.